Hey everyone, this is the sig-auth meeting for March 12th, 2025. So you got a decent amount of stuff on the agenda. So I'll start with the announcement. So hopefully everyone has seen the mailing list thread about Mike Denise officially stepping down as chair and nominating Micah Hausler. We, I guess, like people that kind of sound like Mike as our chairs. Uh, it's kind of fun. Um, and Micah, you're here. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I've been like attending sig-auth for like weekly for or bi-weekly for what, I don't know, 7 years, 8 years or something. So
Yeah.
uh yeah, it's nice to be I hope it's not that much more work.
Don't worry, Micah. We'll find ways to make it slowly creep over time such that you don't
Perfect.
notice.
Perfect. That way I won't leave all at once.
Yep. And then I myself am planning to step down this chair and am nominating Anish as my chair replacement. I will still be a tech lead. Anish, did you want to say anything?
Thank you. I have been working with sig-auth, I think, for the last 3, 4 years actively, and then I'm also one of the maintainers for the Secret Store CSI driver project. It's been really fun writing code, growing in sig-auth, so I'm looking forward to doing more of the work here.
Anisha, I can make do lots of work, so I just need to work on. Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, if anyone has any feedback or anything, certainly you can mail the SIGAUTH Leads mailing list. But I think we got about another week for a lazy consensus before we start opening up all the PRs to make the changes official. Does anybody have any comments on that before we move on to the discussion topics? And I see there's messages in the chat. What is it? Okay, good, good stuff. All right, David is I don't actually know this person's name. Is the other person?
Jian. So he's from China, so he's not able to make it. This is like 2 in the morning or something where he is. But he has been talking with me about the idea. Um, not sure how many people will remember it. I linked to an old issue from 2016, which might be a record, where Eric Toon actually talks about his desire at the time to be able to have a service account. He wanted to work a service account in this case that had permissions to do a thing, but he also wanted to check to see that a user that the controller was acting on behalf of also had permissions to do the thing. And at the time, well, I think you can see if you go back in time, Jordan and I are both sitting there going, I don't really see why we'd want to do that. Well, it's been 9 years, and Jian has come up with a reason why he wants to do it, and I found it pretty compelling. So I guess the permissions model at a high level is you have a requester. The requester has permissions to do something like, in Jian's example, I think it is stop or start a VM. And then a user has permissions. Maybe he has local namespace admin permissions inside of a namespace. So the goal is that a particular request, this requester can say, hey, I want to be limited not just by my permissions, but by my permissions and the permissions of David, who is a namespace admin here. And so if I try to stop and start a VM in that namespace, I'll be able to. If I try to stop one outside that namespace, I will not be able to. And so it's clearly better than impersonation, where you get all the powers of David, because that's not what we desire. We still desire, for auditing purposes, to know this controller, this service account can only do this thing. And at runtime, we want to be sure that we are also constrained by who we're acting on behalf of. So what am I interested in? I'm interested in feedback about whether someone has concerns about the idea in general, whether this exists in other places and there are gotchas where like we've tried to do it and it did bad things, would be really useful. And I've included a PR, and if there aren't objections, then the next step is likely to be a KEP for consideration in 134. So opening it up for thoughts.
Jordan, I see you're unmuted. Did you have thoughts before I go?
No, I was on hardware mute.
I have just a question. Just I realize it needs a cap and everything, but just mechanistically, are you thinking like a header for this that the client still specifies, or so it's on the client to basically scope themselves, or some other mechanism?
I was thinking of a header. There's a PR demonstrating it with a header named act as. I could very flexible for name. I could also see like on behalf of
Okay.
or like
Yeah.
anything. It is header, which makes it both per request, and it also makes it opt-in per request for the client. So that requester has full rights. It's not
Mhm.
a constraint for the requester. It is a constraint so the requester can be sure he's not doing something that the person who's doing it on behalf of isn't allowed to do already.
Gotcha. So it's a new verb, and it's similar to impersonate, except you're just not using a different username, I guess.
And
In
you
audit.
cannot get new permissions. So if I impersonate a user, then
I
in the
see.
example that I gave, the requester
see.
is only able to, okay,
Yeah, it's the intersection.
yes.
Yeah. No, I actually just had an internal use case where this would be really helpful. So or something like this, like where we have, say, just at AWS, we have like the service needs to act in the cluster, and we have end controllers that we want to have act on the cluster or watch the cluster or something. But I don't want every controller to have like the full permissions of the EKS service on a cluster. Today we do use impersonation, so that the controller has to impersonate some other user, which has a different set of permissions. But in act as, you basically say, I only need this subset of a permission set, and I don't have to impersonate.
Correct. So in Jian's use case, it is I want an agent to be able to stop and start VMs. And I also want someone to be able to say, I want you to stop and start this VM for me. And we want to be sure that with this delegation model, we are constrained not just to all access in this, all stop and start in this cluster, but also to namespaces David can do it in. And but we do not want this controller to have the permission to be David and do something like create a pod, because that's an anti-goal. That lets us audit permissions on both sides.
Have you thought about not like some external mechanism to the user's request to impose this? Basically to try to to enforce it out of band of the user's request, or is it necessary to have it as part of the user's request?
Force it out of band of the user's request. I don't know that
like some policy that says you can only act as this, and then when I delete that policy, then the intersection gets removed. I don't know. Maybe that's more discussion
does
for the
that get
cap.
into potentially the second one? Like, so Mo added something which I think is a reference to a prior, can I have a service account on a node that is bounded by the permissions of that node? And I think that's a slightly different thing where it is not per request, and it is the service account cannot make a request that is that a node doesn't have permission for, which I think is different.
Yeah, I guess I'm not even just necessarily thinking of a node. I'm thinking of like, so AWS has a similar concept, like where you can apply like a boundary policy. I put a link in the chat, but basically you can scope down a set of calls that you want to make, even though you might have a more expansive permission, and that can be imposed sort of externally. I don't have super well formed thought about this yet. I think maybe once there's a cap, I'll read more and have probably more input.
Okay. I have included that link in the notes so that both myself and Gian can read through what it does. So that is helpful.
This is related, I think, David. So in Azure, we have the concept of on behalf of in our APIs. But in that concept, it is not an intersection of permissions. It is this service can act on behalf of this user under these constraints. So the service itself never has the permission. Right. So it can act on behalf of the user or on behalf of the user to do a thing. So like, I guess very specifically to your example, right? The controller thing would not itself be able to start and stop VMs. It would, in fact, not be able to. And it would, when it tries to start and stop the VM, it would only be able to do it if the thing it was acting on behalf of could. But that would be constrained, right? So it would have like, but then if it tried to stop a pod or create a pod or whatever, that would fail, right? So it's
In that scenario, how does the service prove that it has the ability to act on behalf of the user?
So it has its authorization policy is constraining itself in the on behalf of, and then in the actual like proof that it can act on behalf of the user is it's sort of like part of the Azure request context. So it's basically like the user authenticated and made the request, so it's like in that stack flow. Basically, it's like it's known.
Like, is it some sort of cryptographic assertion?
I don't know if it's a cryptographic assertion as much as it is like a chain of um, like I think I would describe it as like a chain of context that passes through the system and has some mechanism for how it is trusted. I don't remember the specific details of that piece.
I think it'd be useful to know, because that would be what I think what would separate this, what you just described, from the kube impersonate flow, right? So if something can act on behalf of a user and that user has to provide some sort of proof for the service to provide to say, yeah, really, I can. I could see that doing something similar, but it's very similar to impersonation, and it seems like it would only work with proof that we aren't lying. Otherwise, I would just lie.
Yeah, no, it is based on, yeah, so you do need to have proof in the sense of like it is only possible because there was a user action taken.
Yeah,
It can't be
but
an
I find that idea interesting if we can find a way to provide the proof.
Yeah. I think it's hard in Cube because I don't think we like keep track of this stuff in a way that makes that like easy. Yeah. In an old cluster, I think what would end up happening is the controller just ends up starting and stopping the VM, right? Because the old cluster just wouldn't know anything about ACT as.
Correct.
Which is okay. That's basically probably what you have today, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And is there a reason the controller just can't do a subject access review before it makes the request?
The extra request wasn't particularly appealing, but would that be the same? It's hmm. I'll throw it as an alternative.
Okay. So follow-up question is, do you like or dislike the fact that the admission chain that's run is the controller's admission chain and not the user's admission chain?
I think I like it.
Okay, can you describe to me why?
I think that it more accurately reflects who the owner of the request is.
Okay. But so what would you tell to a cluster admin that had configured like a validating admission policy to restrict these start and VM stops on the user under some conditions that was then ignored because the policy ignored it because it was a controller making the request?
I think that there is a separate bound. Like you can make a story that would be either A or B, right? You can make a story that says, I want to restrict this user and every possible flow from this user. You could also make a story that is, I want to restrict things that are not done via this delegation.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think
I think it would be
I'm
A,
mostly
you
probing
could
here,
want
right?
both A or not A.
Yeah.
But you're asking about admission, Mo, but this is about authorization. Or are you just thinking,
but the request is going to go through admission, right? And so
sure,
if the user of the request stays the controller the whole time, then from the perspective of all of admission, whether it's validating admission or webhook admission or built-in admission, the act as context is actually gone, right? And it really should be, right? Just in the way that bearer token authentication and impersonation and all of those fields get deleted after the handler touches them, I would expect this handler to be gone. And so none of the rest of the stack knows anything about the acting as part, right? So you're sort of limited by that. And as David said, I think both views have some benefit, right? Like it's um,
Yeah, by having admission be unaware of the act as constraint, this doesn't fully close like confused deputy types of things where I might not be able to do a thing. I might have like the coarse grained permission, to hit the endpoint, but if I tried to do the particular thing I'm asking this controller to do for me, admission would smack me. But I can like put it in some other object and have a controller do this, and the controller thinks it is intersecting
groping down?
permissions. Yeah,
And it's just for authorization, not
and
for
it's
admission at that point.
just coarse grained. It's surprising that authorization is informed by it and admission isn't.
Mo, on Azure, which identity is used later on, and do you regret the choice that was made?
in Azure, I don't know if this is the exact semantic, but my abstraction of the semantic is basically when you do this on behalf of flow, you end up effectively having a constrained, I guess, token, for the lack of maybe a better term, that represents the user being acted on behalf of by the service, and it is constrained by the permissions that were granted on the configuration of the on behalf of, and then obviously the users. So it's the user's context but with the services always included. And they can only do that like set of actions that the on behalf of could do. And then obviously the user themselves needs to be able to do it.
Does that sound like both where it, like in the case where I described, the authorizer knows about both here, and the gap is simply admission, at least right now, does not know about it, so it can't make a choice?
I don't know if that layering exactly exists in Azure. of like authorization and admission. Maybe Anish, you might know this better than me, but I don't recall separation at that level.
Whatever policy layers you have are required to be satisfied with both the controller and the act as identity, or at least they have visibility to both. So I'm just trying to understand sort of.
So it's a little bit different, though, right? Because the service or controller, whatever you want to call it, doesn't have the permission until it's in the on behalf flow, right? So it can't do the thing by itself ever. So there's that little bit of nuance. But then yeah, because there isn't like there isn't like different layers of policy. There's like one place where the Azure policy is, and like it's all of it. So I would say, yeah, that the anything that could enforce a policy has the same view on what that policy is. But I think this goes back to one of Micah's big complaints about Cube is that admission and authorization are separate concepts, and you have to reason about them together to understand what the actual policy is, not what the perceived policy is.
I think it would make sense. Seems like it would make sense to allow both so you could have a decision informed by both.
Could you clarify what you mean by both here?
Well, so the authorizer makes a decision based on the acting as user and the requesting user, right? In the example PR that we have. And I can see that it would make sense for admission, which can also be used to make an authorization style decision, to have that same set of knowledge.
So you'd have to pass it through like the user structure or something.
Admission has access. Well, it has access to whatever we want. If we attach it to the request context, we can pull it out wherever we need to. But yeah, thinking it through is
yeah. So that would make this slightly different and novel from impersonation, which cannot be perceived after. I guess it's right after authentication, but before authorization, because you authorize the impersonation, obviously, but then the request and authorization is separated.
Yeah. I would like the idea of finding a way to provide proof that a user actually wanted the thing. I find that really interesting. I don't know how I would do that.
It might be worth digging into what we can figure out from like the cloud providers and see if there's something we could have.
Yeah. Because that would take it from an opt-in, I don't want to do this unless, please enforce for me, to a true, like, yeah, you just can't do it.
Great. See, time check, I guess we're about halfway through.
I think unless there's other comments or someone is, unless there's other comments, I think I've got what we need. The next step would likely be a CAP trying to address these questions and describe more quickly, more crisply, and to discuss.
All right, cool. All right, so we can go on to like my topic, which relates to the act as stuff, but it's slightly different. So Jordan, you're here. I don't see the other person. Is it Vinyak? I forgot your name.
Vinayak.
Yeah, I think I said it wrong. I'm sorry. But I wanted to bring this up because I saw David was talking about act as and it's related to impersonation. I was like, okay, fine. The thing I want to talk about is related to impersonation. So that way, if we're going to go mess around with impersonation or anything in that layer, we at least have some plan. So I wanted to float the idea by you guys of a different approach to building the whole restricted service account thing, which is instead of trying to say that this service account is restricted by the node in some way, I would instead want the service account to be able to impersonate the node under certain contexts. So like it would not be impersonation in the way that you think about it today, right? It would be impersonation bounded by the request context as well. So for example, like I can impersonate my node, but only to get pods. Does that make sense?
How would that be modeled in the permission structure?
Yeah, so the way I did it, which you can probably say is questionable, but it is a way to do it, is so in this little POC, so the first thing is basically like, check the token and make sure that the service account is trying to impersonate the node that it's on, which you can just tell from the user info and the impersonation part. Then there's a cluster level authorization check for just the concept of impersonating your node. So that's like, can you impersonate your scheduled node or not? Yes or no? And then the final thing, which is I think the answer to your question, David, is can you do it within the current request? And so the way I modeled it is basically, I just said that in order to check if you were allowed to do it for impersonation, I would just make an authorization check for the current request, but I would offset the group, the entire request, with a suffix. So what that ends up looking like is when you want to authorize, I should have put this in YAML so this was slightly easier to read. So I have this node, and then I have the default service account in the default namespace, and I give it the ability to impersonate a scheduled node, the global check. And then if I wanted to list pods, I have to give it under this other API group, which is just a concatenation. And the assumption I'm obviously making is that this authorization means nothing in the regular case. But during this custom check, it allows you to have a custom way of describing that. So it's a expression. You can imagine other expressions of this delegation. But that's kind of how it ends up working out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'll attempt to speak for Vinay because we've discussed it at length. I think from our side, we're not too concerned with the mechanism. Our goal is we want to stop stealing kubelet credentials to get node restriction.
Yeah. So
I think we could accept any mechanism that lets us do that.
So I do think this lets you do that. The thing this lets you do that wasn't in the design that had been previously shared, which I know I will end up needing, is the ability for that service account to also do things that are like unrelated to the kubelet, like get some custom resource or whatever, without having to grant kubelet the ability to do that.
That makes sense, yeah.
Right. And so that's why I modeled it as an impersonation, right? Because when the workload wants to just do things as itself, it just makes regular requests. And when it wants to be making requests that it can't make, but its node can, then it just impersonates the node. And as long as that's allowed, then you get the exact behavior that the node gets.
So you're sort of like overloading is it the action? No, maybe I got that wrong. Oh yeah, the action on port 10 with like an association of the sort of the resource that you want to act on.
Yeah, so this is just the, hey, is this service account like a node agent basically? Like, is it supposed to be a node agent at all, right? Like that's step
Right.
0, like before we even ask any question. And then it's basically like, okay, can that service account do this like sort of offset request? I don't know what to call it. And if it can, we're saying that, okay, during impersonation, we're saying that that's allowed.
Yeah. And what's the leading dot for? Is that just to differentiate it
No,
from something else?
the leading dot is because the core API group is empty string. So this would be like, so I don't know, like
Okay.
eks.maws.io dot bleh, or
Oh, for the resource group. Okay.
right. It just happens that the core API group is empty
I
string
see.
to make these things awkward.
Okay. So if you did like apps, you would do for deployment.
Yeah, so that's what is that is it it's just apps, right? It's just apps.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be
Okay.
apps dot this string, right? So
Okay.
it's a way of granting a permission that is meaningless outside of this context. So there might be other ways to do that. David?
So similar to your question to me, when this goes through the rest of the REST handling, it's going to show up as the node.
Mhm.
And so things like apply configuration for a pod status is going to be owned. Like you can specify your own field manager, but by default, it's going to be the one for the node.
Yeah. So this is not trying to hide the fact that you are impersonating the node, which is what would be happening today when you just mount the kubelet credentials. Is you are literally the node. There is no difference.
Not arguing with it, Mo. I'm making sure that that is indeed what it does.
Yeah. No, that was intentional. It was not accidental. So the Kubernetes audit log will still retain the fact that it was that service account that did this, because it will show the user as the original service account and the impersonated user as the node. But from the perspective of admission and anything else in the stack, it is just the node.
I'm not sure if I'm grasping the. So I understand the first level of RBAC setup here, where we're saying like, hey, this is allowed to be a node impersonating service account. I'm not sure I'm grasping what the cluster role at line 425 to 441.
Yeah.
Is this giving specific subsets of node permissions that are allowed, or is this assigning extra permissions to the service account?
Yeah. So what this is saying is when you are impersonating the node, the request that you are making basically needs to fit within these permissions. So it's an attenuation of impersonation. So it's not you can impersonate your node and that's it. It's you can impersonate your node and your requests need to have a particular shape. So right now you can see that this is commented out. So this is not active. So this first request here, this first request would pass because it's within the first permission that is granted. But the second request would not pass because that line is those lines are commented out and you don't have that permission.
Is that okay? Yeah, I get it. I don't. How important do you think that is? Like to have an attenuated set of the node permissions as opposed to just the node permissions straight up?
Pretty important. Nodes are really powerful. A service account that you wanted to have like one read-only permission feels really bad to give it like super powerful write permissions just so you can intersect it with the node.
Yeah, I'll throw out you can read secrets, but if your thing doesn't need to do that, there's no reason to give it permissions to read the secrets on the node.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, I certainly the design would be trivial if we didn't care about the intersection effectively of those things, but I think we really care about the intersection. So I think in any if we were to pursue basically a flow where node agents can impersonate their node, there has to be some mechanism for constraining that to specific context, right? And it is a little bit hard to express because our authorization system can express a user performing a action. It can't really express two users performing an action.
Yet.
Would this be maybe cleaner if it was? I get putting in an RBAC, and maybe we get some like anti-escalation. but like I could imagine this is a service account allowed to impersonate the node just being a field on a service account that some sort of admission controller locks down to only admins can set it or something.
Or
And-
yeah, I
and-
guess that doesn't necessarily matter as much. I guess if we go back to the act as topic for a second, right? This whole thing right here, this whole delegation thing, I could imagine that being pulled out as a generic concept for impersonation outside of the scope of node impersonation, right? Where today you can only you can impersonate something. It would, I think, impersonation v2 or whatever you want to call it would be, hey, you can impersonate Mo, but you can only do that while you're getting pods. And so if Mo can get pods, that's great. If Mo can't get pods, not going to work. But it does not matter if you yourself cannot get pods. Your permission is not relevant there. It's
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I do like the fact that this does not require overgranting to kubelets. A comment about trying to put this on a service account itself. Service account permissions are editable by namespace editors. I wouldn't expect my namespace editor to be able to express this service account should have the power of a node. I don't think that's something that's appropriate to give to namespace editors or admins even. So I do think that there's a benefit to having it in the RBAC, or rather have the permission.
At some cluster level object.
Yes, because I think it's a cluster scopes decision.
So that's why the authorization check is cluster scope. So it only works with the cluster role binding. And obviously we're using RBAC as the example, right? But just like AKS and GKE we have our own authorization webhooks, right? So we don't need to honor this via this flow, right? We can just use our own webhooks to do it. But it would be silly to have a flow that could not be honored through RBAC because that would annoy lots of people.
It's worth noting, I think this requires changing the implementation of the thing the service account is running as, which is pretty painful, rather than it being a pure policy. Like you couldn't take an existing workload that takes a kube config and today is being fed a node kube config and instead just
in your use case, Jordan, you can basically, because you would just set the impersonate headers on the kube config.
So like a pod, the goal of the other cap in progress doc was to be able to collapse onto sort of normal service account credentials. So I guess you wouldn't be able to do that. You would have to take.
It's a write a kube config still because it's not using the in cluster.
And a auto renewing token into a kube config structure that also set these impersonate headers, I guess.
Yeah, you can, right? Because you just point it at the file and it'll be fine. Yeah. So I mean, yeah. But you are right. There might be some minor change. I did think through that. I felt like it was okay because being
able to do it in the kube config is better than having. I was thinking it would have to set it in headers. I forgot we could set that in kube config.
I mean, I don't know why we can set those headers in kube config. I don't think I've ever actually seen anyone use them, but okay. I guess we found the user. Like, I don't want to ask why you use them. It's just such a weird thing to do. Like, statically say, I want to be someone else. But okay. More power to everyone who wants to do it. But yeah, so I don't know. I feel like there is. I feel like, David, would you feel like your act as thing can't just be implemented in restricted impersonation. If you were okay with your
I
controller.
just added an item. I took note on it. I think I could get what I want out of that, and it would be slightly better. It'd be slightly. The differences of who's doing it matter maybe a little bit, maybe not enough, to justify the difference. But I did take a note on it. Gian, I assume, is going to watch the recording and read the notes.
Okay. Sounds good.
It doesn't look particularly pretty. I will say that, but does it?
It's still pretty
It's-
small.
I agree. It's significantly better than the previous attempt, I think, at restricting a service account to the permissions of that node. I like it. I like not having to overgrant a lot. It doesn't really bother me. If you want to take advantage of this, you have to do a little bit of work. And yeah, I think it does resolve the you shouldn't have permissions to do this thing at all. It doesn't require proof, but I can't think of a way to do proof. So
Yeah, I think we'd have to have a more dramatic authentication level change to come up with some mechanism to track that.
I agree.
Okay. We have 15 minutes left. Does anyone else have anything on this topic before we go to Tahir's stressful conversation about stressing all of this out? Cool. Tahir, you have the floor then, sir.
Okay. I'll try not to take 15 minutes. But basically, so today the status quo is if you don't opt out, we inject a service account token that has some permissions on Kube API server into your pod. And in theory, you can use that to connect to Kube API server. Probably, I'm just guessing, but certainly greater than 90% of workloads that are ever deployed into Kubernetes have no need of that token. They are just workloads running their web server. They don't really care about the fact that they're running in a Kubernetes cluster, and they don't need any permissions to do anything on API server. It would be really, really nice if we could find a way to change the default so that you have to opt in to receiving credentials. The reason I'm thinking about this is twofold. One is our recent work on allowing external signers for service account tokens. We have internally run scale testing and everything works, but it is somewhat stressful on the external signer in a very large cluster, talking 15,000 nodes with hundreds of work pods on each node. To actually keep up with the signing requests. We had to raise quotas. We had to work with our team that does HSMs to actually support that scale. And it's a little bit of a difficult, a bitter pill to swallow when we know that, none of those workloads are actually going to use those credentials. We're burning a lot of asymmetric crypto just signing things that no one will ever use. The other reason I'm thinking about this is thinking about pod certificates. In my mind, eventually the idea is instead of connecting to Kube API server with a token, you would be able to transparently instead connect to Kube API server with a certificate of some kind issued through a pod certificate mechanism. So at some point, we would want to consider how we do that migration. I think that migration is a lot easier. I guess we can spend energy thinking about how to migrate 100% of Kubernetes workloads from tokens to certificates, or we can spend that time recognizing that most of those workloads don't even use their tokens. We could maybe spend that energy thinking about getting rid of those tokens without replacing them. But I recognize that that is a large and disruptive change that might be certainly couldn't be just done at the Kubernetes level. You might have to have a switch that cloud providers could throw first, maybe, and see what our customers do. Certainly, we have a lot of large customers who might have teams that would grumble, but it's a little difficult for them. Like their security teams would be in support of like not issuing credentials that no one's going to use. I think that's basically all I have to say about it. Just want to start people. I want to plant that thought. I don't think we could are in a position to do anything about it for a long time, but
David is challenging me to turn on my camera so you all can see my face. The switch from tokens to pod certificates, I think, would always have to be opt-in. Like we can't assume that the stuff running in pods is using client Go. Like it was sort of a stretch to over multiple years go from a non-renewing token to a renewing token existing in the same location as a file. Like even that was a stretch. Switching from one file that has a token to a different file that has like a cert key pair, I don't think we will ever be able to do that without some type of opt-in. It might be an opt-in on the pod, or it might be an opt-in like at the service account level, or but some type of opt-in. So I don't think we're ever going to do that transparently. If whatever that opt-in is might be able to be opted into at a cluster level, so that cluster providers could turn it on for customers who want it or ready or whatever they deem the risk is. That's fine. We already have a flag on service account that lets you say, I don't want tokens. We also have the same flag on pods that lets you say, I don't want tokens. If we wanted to move in this direction, making it easy to set that to, if you don't have a preference, you don't get a token, like at more granular levels per service account. Mutating admission that defaults that for people, like tools that people who want this could use to get basically this behavior now in specific namespaces or clusters if they wanted it.
I also thought mutating admission policy, but I think it happens after defaulting happens, Jordan.
This doesn't default. I think it stays nil.
It stays nil? Okay. If it doesn't default, then I would agree.
Wait. I thought it defaulted at the pod level, but not at the service account level.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, I remember this because it was super ugly when you wanted to like remove the volume. Like you had to like manually remove the volume from the pod.
Now, if we made that some kind of an option, I would be like, if someone was brave enough to set it on their cluster.
I mean, I was brave enough to stop token extension. I don't think I'm brave enough to do this.
Yeah, but Tahir said that Google was going to do it first.
I mean, I could see us doing something like this for the extra large clusters too, for the same reasons, right? And that's also not necessarily a default on for everybody that we be as afraid of breaking the world, but more like we have special use cases where people are spending enough money to have mega clusters and they understand that there will be trade-offs, and this is a trade-off that they would make.
But the fields are pointers in both service account and pod, and neither have defaulting. So they stay nil unless...
No, I think in the service account admission, we said it before anything else would see it, right?
If we do, I can't find it in the code.
Sorry. We don't set
fire
the
one up and
set the
prove
volume.
Yeah.
But yeah, sure, we could figure it out either way. So certainly if we wanted to have a knob that made it so that like an entire cluster or something just had the inverted default, we could certainly do that, and it would just be an opt-in knob maybe at the cluster level if you wanted that. That might not be flexible enough because that would require like wholesale migration of your cluster beforehand somehow.
Do we have any capabilities today to audit tokens that go unused? I'm trying to think about how we might.
Yeah, I remember bringing this up with Jordan a while back, but he was like, "Well, what if they like just read the token off of disk and parsed it, but didn't use it?" I was like, "Technically possible,
screw them.
Jordan." Yeah, I was like, I didn't say it out loud, but I was like, "Okay, fine, technically possible." Diminishing.
So, yeah, I'm just thinking
I
of
mean,
like what we could do. Oh, sorry.
someone could have multiple audiences on that token. Not that they should, but they could have multiple audiences on that token and use it externally to QAPI server, and you would never know.
Not the
Not the default one though, right?
does
Oh,
it
okay, maybe not.
They could replace the default token with
Oh, they
their
could
own
replace-
volume in the same place.
Let's play how crazy can people be?
Sorry.
Yeah, like if you have all the audit stuff from all the tokens that were minted and all the tokens that were used, now that we have JTI, like credential ID stuff, you could like, do a lot of intersecting and figure out what isn't using.
Maybe I'll think about this a little bit from the Google side. Like I think you're right, Jordan. If we have JTIs collected in centralized audit logs, we may be able to do some sort of recommender that says, like, I think similar to IAM policy, like we have a little widget that pops up and it's like, hey, you've granted 10,000 permissions that aren't used, delete them. Yeah. We may be able to do something similar, and then whether you have some hard data to like look at.
Yeah.
I'll think about it.
Okay.
I wanted to ask the question in relation to the first point you made to here around the load on the external signer. So we send the payload to the signer itself. So it can certainly make decisions based off of the payload, and you can certainly distinguish tokens that are meant for API server versus external audiences or whatever. I don't know if anyone's considered any other mechanisms to try to reduce the load on the signer. Certainly, like if you wanted to, you could just use a local key for the API server ones and only use the external signer or externally important stuff if that's mattered.
Well, I think at least on GK, like we're planning to go the opposite direction. We're gonna move everything to external signing, even if a customer isn't providing their own key.
No, when I say local, right, what I mean is within the external signer, it could have a local key that is for the cluster's audience, right? That is an approach. I don't think any of us really likes that approach because it's like external signing, maybe, and it's not super great as in like an API. And sort of, I just did like rough math on like QPS of like all AKS clusters and the amount of signing to have. And I basically submitted that as requirements to our infrastructure. So it says, please support. That's what I need. I expect no changes on the Kubernetes side. But I think certainly a next step could be is after maybe each year you collect some data to see how practical it is to get a cluster into the state that that it's safe to make a switch. I think having that switch, I don't think anyone's going to complain about having that capability. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
But I don't think I would volunteer to go first. Just to...
I mean, if you gave me a switch, I wouldn't mind allowing the customer to set the switch. I just wouldn't do it for them. And then if they set the switch,
yeah, I agree.
We got like a minute. Anyone have anything?
I'm a little more prescriptive in my security case, but I understand it'll be difficult.
There we go. I guess we can have a minute back. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks, maybe.
Yeah.
See ya.